And yes, please feel free to step out. What we thought we would do, we sit down there? That's all right. Is open it up to questions for the whole group now that you've seen all this. If that doesn't fly, I've certainly got questions. But let me first take that. Is there something that strikes you all? It's like this told a more complete story? Is there a piece that you feel is missing? I'll fire away. You have three literal drought experts in the room. It's like an undergraduate classroom. Nobody wants to talk. So I will. I mean, I'm struck by, I'm trying to get out of the camera. So Mike just talked explicitly, you talked explicitly about operationalizing some of the science, basically. So I'm wondering, maybe Connie and Chris, you're working directly with Navajo Forestry. So to some extent, your work is applied at a gate, or intended to be. But you're sitting in sort of a time scale way right now, because where you're talking about seasonal, event-driven drought, you guys are looking more in the future. So I guess I'm wondering how we implement some of this stuff in terms of planning and management. So for example, now that we have insights about this, we all had flavors here, right? With specific events and specific seasons and stuff. But with runoff efficiency, so what can water management do with that? Or even to some extent, what can forestry do with that? What's the take home? And if you're trying to plan for what appears to be significantly warmer 21st century, and we know that runoff efficiency is related to it. So what do you do?
Yeah, should I?
It's anybody go. Okay. It's fine. That's fine where it is.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things with the runoff efficiency that we've been working. Actually, the projects we've been working on, the two of them have been with water resource managers. So we have partners in Salt River Project, Colorado River Basin Reclamation, the Forecast Center folks have all kind of been nudging us this way. In fact, the term runoff efficiency comes from them. But I think that, for traditionally forecasting is based on snowpack, the amount of snowpack, April 1st. There's a lot of, let's look at, and the eye now is on the snowpack. How's that snowpack developing? But it hasn't really considered temperature so much. And so when we presented these results to our water managers, I don't know when it was, I guess it was a year ago, but also this work was again presented and other people are looking at temperature. Last summer, I think water managers started thinking about, first of all, these temperatures, the warming temperatures recently have implications for how we're forecasting into the future. The Bureau of Reclamation sort of runs their 109-year model incrementally, and some of their stakeholders at the meeting they were at saying, maybe it's not wise to consider, those earlier parts of the 20th century where the temperatures were cool. Maybe we should be just looking at the last 25 years. And in fact, Jim Prairie started looking at projections based on the models based on just the last 25 years. So that's what they're looking at. It's like, as we go into the future, maybe we're using the part of the record that has more influence of warmer temperatures. And the other one is, and I think it was Flava Lehner and others and Andy Wood are looking at what happens if you integrate temperature in your forecast, in your seasonal forecast, not just snowpack, but what's the temperature doing? And that's what our work really implies, that you're going to have different, your resulting runoff is going to be different depending on the temperatures. If you happen to luck into a not so hot year, you may benefit from that. If you're looking at a really warm year, like maybe we are now, and actually our work was saying it really marched through into the runoff season is the most critical time. Maybe you want to scale back, even if it's a good snowpack year, maybe you want to scale back and go, well, good snowpack, but we got really warm temperatures. So there's a couple ways.
Scale back in terms of storage?
In terms of your forecast of runoff and storage, yeah. So there's a couple ways that people are already talking about incorporating this information, which again, isn't just what we're doing, but I think there's a body of research that's looking more closely at temperature and its influence on water resources.
And that what you're saying is that's penetrated into the management community to some extent now.
Yeah, it's interesting. This workshop that we had at the Southern Nevada Water Authority put on this workshop run with their stakeholders or with their partners, and they identified the scientists they wanted to come and talk to them. And one of their big focuses was on temperature. And they're like, and this was last summer, and I think it was dawning on them that this really is a big deal at that point. It's interesting to see that it's not just about snow; it's about temperature as well.
Chris, what's the forest management version of this? Because if I understand your synoptic view there correctly, the synchronicity is a little, maybe good news, maybe bad news. I'm not sure, because it seems like it's at the higher elevation stands in those two species. They've been okay. They haven't really been in tune with the climate.
I think that's the good news.
So the bad news.
The bad news is that they're not that way anymore. They're changing.
So if you're a manager, that's a shocking. So the park it out curve is distressing. Every time I've seen that curve, it just makes you want to like jump off a cliff because it just looks like all the trees are going to die. It's easy to read that curve as saying all the trees are going to die. That's not an option if you're a forest manager, to just go, uh-oh, in 40 years all our trees are going to die.
Yeah, you can't just throw in your hat. You got to stay in the game, right? So our study really came out of that paper, and because it has that stark outlook, and we wanted to know, we called it triage the landscape. We wanted to be able to give an assessment across a big landscape with a lot of variability on it. You know, where are the hot spots, where are the cool spots in terms of how you respond to climate. And the idea was that the hot spots will be places that, you know, hey, this isn't looking so good, you know, that those projections might really be right. The cool spots be like, don't worry about it. It's not here yet. You can manage this, you know, you can go about it, you can get the resources you need from those areas. And so it was a way to kind of boil down a really big area to, you know, differences. I think there's still an aspect of that, but as we kept doing this study, we started scratching our heads and wondering if we were right or not. That, you know, maybe places that had that good news that hadn't really reflected climate over 100 years, now they're getting hit by droughts. Maybe those are the areas that actually are going to go down, in areas that lower elevations where trees are very well adapted to drought. And, you know, some of the trees in this data set survived the 1580s mega drought and are still growing and still alive. Don't necessarily look bad when you're out there, but again, that's where the mechanisms of drought mortality come into play that we really don't know yet. So I kind of favor more the previous of like, I think it's still going that way, but as I said at the end of the talk, when you synchronize anything across a whole landscape, be it management, growth, disturbance, it invites spread of anything. So insect outbreaks or fire or something like that. If everybody is stressed, then your barriers come down. So that's the kind of alarming part.
So at this point, that for the Navajo foresters, it's sort of like trying to integrate this knowledge into how they go about their business. Is that right? I
think that's where we're at. I mean, part of it started with like, okay, that's good information. You know, it's good to know how old our trees are, what the growth patterns look like, and how much we should pay attention to climate in forecasting. I think it'll be a long time before we really know what kind of management actions on the ground ameliorated this, accelerated these patterns. You know, that is kind of something I really want to do. You know, what kind of management can we do in a place that looks like it's really going to get hit hard by drought to reduce the effect of it? And, you know, does that exist? There's only so many options when it comes to management, and it's a really complicated dynamic in terms of regulations and markets and things like that. Forest management is complicated.
Especially in a dry place. Do you want to add anything to this part?
I think what's interesting is that what I'm coming at this as kind of a climate person in the Southwest doing drought monitoring is that I think in our realm, we're trying to tell this kind of one-size-fits-all drought story, and drought becomes sort of discrete monolithic, but Connie and Chris are defining very different types of drought at different timescales and different flavors. And so what I want to try to get to is can we, when we tell a drought story in the Southwest, can we be more specific of what we're talking about? Like, are we talking about forest drought? Are we talking about stream flow drought? Are we talking about rangeland drought? And then be able to sort of lay that out, because now I'm, when we look at some of the drought maps, I'm not sure if it's the worst case scenario of what the reality is, or it's the best, or the truth is somewhere in the middle. And that's what's kind of driving me forward, is how do we integrate a lot of this research and then tease it back out and then lay on the table. This is sort of the range of types of drought that we're dealing with right now, and funnel different managers to those different stories and help them think about it more in a more nuanced way.
Great. So I want to jump in. There's a couple on mine that have been on, and it actually ties to that thing you just said. One of the questions was regarding some of the different definitions of drought. So, I mean, you sort of hit on that a little bit, but it was asking basically what are some of the different definitions of drought that you might find interesting or useful? And then the other, just as a two-parter, if you've looked at any coupling of drought conditions with groundwater recharge versus drawdown, which I realize might be more on the hydro side. So you can go to the first one.
Okay, so, I mean, climatologists have defined drought, and maybe we're not the right ones to do it, right? I mean, meteorological, hydrological, socioeconomic, ethnicity, the sort of classic paradigm of drought mitigation center. But they all sort of, they go back to just timescales of meteorological inputs, right? And that's not good enough, because we don't actually know what we're trying to inform, right? So it's got to be this sort of back and forth. And I believe, and I think we've got some evidence of this, is that if we can work more closely with managers on the ground, that they can help us point to specific timing and amounts and point back to a historical data set that'll help us say, oh, that's what you mean when I call that meteorological drought, but this is a management drought of this particular thing. And then we can then, put away 40 of these indices and focus on these two, and then we'll have a much better map or index or something for that specific thing. So it's a lot of work, I think, to do it, but that's where we need to go next. I think in a lot of our research.
So there was the groundwater.
The quick one about, is there any work coupling drought conditions with groundwater recharge or drawdown that you know of? Or the work?
It's all Meixner's stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. Meister just published. His group just published.
Yep.
I saw Marcos first, and then Bill. Marcos, I think that was your hand.
Oh, sure. So I'm really intrigued by this idea of different flavors of drought. And one of the things about the Forest Drought Severity Index moving into the future that concerns me a little bit is it's more sort of a temperature-driven drought, because the skill of the models is much better at predicting temperatures than it is at predicting winter precipitation. He said that the precipitation is uncertain. And so talking with managers, I mean, so to me, that seems like a worst case scenario, because it's temperature driven, but it's not incorporating variability in winter precipitation or extreme events. I mean, what Mike was showing, a really, really big fall storm or winter storm that may be more rain versus snow. So talking to managers, how would you explain that uncertainty, or that just knowledge that we don't quite have yet moving into the future? Is that something you talk to managers? I'm curious.
In terms of forestry, yeah, and we've seen that. Even while we were doing this field work, I think 2015 was a really dry winter. We were coming into June, our fire season, and I was nervous about even being able to do field work. And then we spent 2 or 3 weeks in the rain, in May and June, when we don't normally expect to get those kinds of events. So it's kind of like, there's trends and there's events. And so we think about it as you kind of have to plan for increased levels of stress and the disturbances that are going to come along with that. But with that caveat that, we might get out of it. We might get out of it for a season, like we did in 2015, where it really shut down any kind of fire risk, at least on that landscape, became very green. But we might, if we get some sort of large ocean dynamic, we might enter into a 5 or a 10-year period that's actually not so bad. So it's, one thing Craig Allen does is he shows that decline in forest stress index that I showed, and then he draws on it this kind of wave of like, climate's really going to do this, and we're going to have a decade here and there when it's not so bad. And instead of just kind of riding those out, the management implication is know when you're in one and take advantage of it, and do things on the ground that are going to help you, because when it gets bad, it's going to be really bad. So that's kind of all we can do. And if you look back in time, the 1980s was one of those windows when, in terms of fire management, we could have put a lot more fire on the ground than we allowed happen because it was wetter. And that, I think, would have saved us from some of the real extreme events we've had in the last couple of decades.
Connie, do you want to comment on that at all? Or?
Yeah, I think that's kind of our message too, is that even though we have, we have some good certainty about warming temperatures, you know, we have this variability of precipitation and taking advantage of those years where they're wet, even if like in the case of runoff, you're not getting as much as you might have back, you know, in the early part of the century. Take advantage of those, and also take advantage of those, you know, temperature trends are like this, but you still have variability in temperature as well. So like Chris said, take advantage of those years. Realize that those are precious years when you may not have, you know, as warm a temperature, you know, for whatever reason, and just, you know, be more dynamic in your water management if you can.
Question?
Really like Mike's ideas on rainfall effectiveness, on soil moisture, and especially when you get the rain. Spring is good. Late summer, you get a lot of rain, but it isn't going to do much. So my question to you is, can you devise a rainfall effectiveness numerical index?
Yeah, I'd love to. That's my inclination, but we may end up doing that in this future research. What I also want to do is want to double back and go back to some of the simpler drought indices. They may already be that rainfall effectiveness index if they're used more appropriately. And that's what's really interesting to me, is that we've got 3 or 4 or 5 new indices coming out every year now, and they're more and more sophisticated. One of those might be that thing. And I want to be able to draw that out and say, this works best for the Southwest because it's capturing that variability. Maybe I could just redo it and then name it after myself. Strategy 2.
The Crimmins Index. Yes. Oh, please.
I have a bark beetle question. It might be out of scope because there's biology of bark beetles, but
Chris, you're on bat here.
I'm sweating.
I think you got the expert.
if it's out of scope, just forget it. But are the bark beetles attacking living, healthy trees, or are they attacking trees that may be basically ecologically dead because of the stress they're already in from temperature and moisture? And therefore, we really should be focusing on temperature and moisture and not on bark beetles if they're really just thriving on ecologically dead trees anyway, killed by other factors.
It's an interesting term, ecologically dead trees. The answer to the first part of that, are they hitting these trees that are going to go, or are they hitting healthy trees? To the best of my knowledge, which isn't super extensive in terms of bark beetles, it's actually both. That they like to start on trees that are stressed and have reduced resources for defense, but they can spread. And once that population gets going, they can attack a very healthy tree just fine, and they can do a lot of damage, even kill it. So that's when we get to outbreak phases, it's really widespread. Whether the trees that are succumbing to bark beetles are ecologically dead and couldn't pull back out, say if bark beetles never entered the scene, I don't know. I would be very hesitant to call a tree dead on the landscape before it's actually suffered mortality. But yeah, bark beetles do take advantage of it. And so I wouldn't, again, like, you know, I'm fighting the levels of my knowledge here, but you know, I wouldn't say that shifting the focus would be the best path forward. Although I think, you know, as always, an integrative look at things is smart.
It's a great question. Marie-Blanche?
I want to dig a little further into the kind of data and science you're producing and how that's really being used by the people, either the water managers, of course, or the rangeland managers. And for a water manager, you have a little bit of a bigger window of management timing. But how about what every rangeland manager wants, seasonal forecasting? I want to know what's going to happen. Can you tell me what the monsoon is going to look like next summer? And so how do we...
Are you actually asking that question?
You do that. So when you look at, very interesting looking back at what the droughts in 1972 looked like, or the one in 2005, and how this year compares to this year. So what does a land manager to do with this information? How do they incorporate that kind of, knowing there's such a variability where you live compared to where their friend lives 10 miles away? What are they going to do with this information, and how do they incorporate that in their annual management plan? How can they, are we just dumping them and say, okay, good luck with that? Or are we trying to, as much as you can, making them understand the implication for the future?
Should I?
Sorry.
Were you talking at me?
That seemed like it was
So the slide I didn't have in there is all of this stems out of the reason. So there's two parts to this answer. Is that the reason to look at these drought indices is that they're only useful if they're part of an actual drought plan, and the idea of triggering a drought plan. So there's efforts at the beginning to think about what you're trying to manage or the resources that you're trying to protect or some kind of operation, and that the drought monitoring helps you anticipate some kind of impact that you could mitigate going forward, right? So there's all that effort that has to happen up front, and that you can think about this kind of in a very specific, concrete way. And then there's this time aspect of getting managers on board with our vernacular and our jargon and our indices. And so right now there's a real big challenge for that community to keep up with our new stuff, right? And so the SBI has been around for quite a while now, and it's finally caught on in some areas. And you're seeing it used in Forest Service planning. You're seeing it show up in different, ranching, probably because I presented on it, but even from other agency efforts. So to have the inertia in that direction and then to introduce something else on top of it, I think is a little bit out of step. So focusing on the planning, thinking about the triggers, thinking about how the indices actually help trigger a response, and then using the right indices that are simple and maybe already in hand is the way that I'm thinking about it. It doesn't preclude that we shouldn't be out on the bleeding edge, thinking of the new thing, the next index, but let's try to bring everybody along. And then on the seasonal forecasting side, knowing what's going to happen next season isn't useful if you don't know where you're at right now and you don't have a plan. So that to me is always a bit of a distraction in these discussions.
Please.
I may break up here. I'm on the edge of going to the hospital here, I think. But backing way up from an industry standpoint, you're looking at best management practices. And so I'm seeing from you the bow wave of new information. You've got too many variables to deal with, and you haven't decided what those variables mean. So you're describing the need for a new job, which is a climatic forecasting mediator who will tell you for your area what indices you need to do under the best management practices that are reigning at the moment to get the job done of forecasting for you for next season for growing your corn or growing your cows or whatever. So you're looking at it from the standpoint of, I've got all this information, and you're focusing down. So for instance, you three are all looking on the Colorado Plateau. More than half of Arizona is below 2 kilometers elevation. So ratios of what's going on with the ponderosa, Doug fir, pinon forest are not going to be relevant to anybody much below the Colorado, the Mogollon Rim. So what are you going to tell somebody who's only interested in water skiing on Lake Havasu? So you need a different person for that. So you need to subset your interests to get the application for exactly what you're doing on the Navajo res, and kind of carve out and not look at the rest of that stuff unless you're asked a general question.
Right.
But you almost need a clearinghouse to find the experts to go to make a relevant data set for your area.
I think you just described
I was going to say, I'm having
Maybe
a
we're
real.
not doing a very good job of what I'm working into.
Because Mike knows I have very different interests. I'm interested in the low desert, and I do work on saguaros. So you're talking about soil temperatures below 30 centimeters and activity there, that's in the root zone of saguaros.
Right.
And so that's relevant.
Yeah,
So-
and so Bill, just to be clear, on mine, I'm trying to go pan-Arizona,
Right.
from low to high, and
Right.
try to think very generically about how we can do this to meet a lot of needs at once. But it always points back to you have a very specific interest, and so you will need to be pointed at a very specific data set.
Right.
Absolutely.
And I'm seeing relevancies in what Chris is talking about, because you pick an elevation zone where the plants are are sensitive to changes in various variables, and then see what relates, to that. So I'm looking the opposite end. I'm looking at the lowest elevations and where they're sensitive.
We were demonstrating our point in a way, because I mean, I think what I took from this collection here is where you are matters, what you care about matters, and the broad indices, your point, are problematic. Whether it's a specific person who can answer the question, I'm not sure, because we still have to, I mean, Kathy Chavez, I think, might still be here. We still have to plan broadly.
Yeah.
So the question is, what's best practices for integrating science, which is what's
But you also have to have intellectual honesty, so that parameters that you know about that have no relevance, and you're taking a huge grant.
That is exactly a point that I completely agree with. And I think this is where we failed in sort of drought policy, the integration of science into decisions, right? We tend to think of drought as a monolithic thing, right? This demonstrates clearly that's not the case.
And it's not to argue that we're doing it wrong right now. I'm just, generic region drought monitoring has to be done with the indices that we have, and we have to tell a broad story. What I'm saying is that we need to have that, but then we need to have the levels and layers below it that allow us to drill in, and then people to tease out the information.
Yeah, see, not everybody's intellectually honest the way you are, Mike.
On that point, so we have one quick online question, which is a real softball. Go for it.
Basically, what's the long-term prognosis for drought conditions in Arizona? 50 to 100 years. For the next 50 to 100 years.
I'm not a paleo person, so I can't answer.
That's not paleo.
It's a long time.
That's the opposite.
I know it is.
I'll do the job of pointing toward the expert. Call Joel and Russell and ask you that one.
Yeah.
You guys have an opinion about what does drought future look like? I mean, from each of your stories, you have a version of this, right?
It's going to get warmer. I think it's clear that's going to impact, moisture availability.
Seems like each of these systems.
Yeah.
That was another consistent theme.
Yeah, and I would, it's Marco's point too about, I think timing is everything here, and I think that background temperatures, and I think as Chris said too, is that there will be surprises in the future in situations where it doesn't seem as bad, but the background stresses, I think, will always be pushing on everything.
Yeah.
And we can't count on the oddly timed surprises to save us very often.
Well,
will be their occasion.
This is Connie's point too.
Yes.
I mean, you may wind up with what you expect to be a pretty good runoff year, and boom, you're hosed, because it happened to be the warmest year in the record, or season, whatever. Okay, on that happy note, why do these things always end this way? Thank you all for coming, and thank you all who are online who can see me, and thanks to you guys. So one more round of applause. You got away without having to answer a question about the water year so far.